All right, good evening. It is 7 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. My name is Stephanie Smith. I am the Director of School Counseling here at Ridge High School, and it is my privilege every day to work alongside these fantastic school counselors. Your children are in great hands, and no matter where you are in this process with your junior, if you have a current junior, if this is your first child, preparing for post-secondary education and college planning, if this is your third or fourth rodeo, no matter what your experience level is, we look forward to working with you and with your child, and we love this work that we do. So a few housekeeping things for tonight before we get started. The format of tonight's presentation is a typical PowerPoint presentation style, and then we will also show you a short video of Naviance, a software program that we use for post-secondary planning. And then the later half of the presentation, we will actually take a Q&A. And so any questions that you have, feel free. We will have two MCs working the microphones to take your questions, and the counselors are here to answer for you. We are recording tonight, and so we just ask that any questions that you do ask, please have them be for the benefit of the group, and anything that's really specific to you, your child, your family, you can always contact us individually, and we can help you, of course. So we are recording tonight. We will also post the PowerPoint slides and the video and the recording, so that way you can access it as a family and refer to anything should you need it at a later date. We also ask that you just take in the information tonight. You don't have to take pictures of anything since we are posting everything as well. And with no further ado, I will pass it off to Mrs. McGivney to get us started.
Good evening. As Mrs. Smith said, my name is Mrs. McGivney, and I have the honor of starting off our presentation this evening. So let's get started. This time in junior year is really exciting. As counselors, we get to turn our attention back to juniors after just working with the seniors and start the process all over again, really from the beginning. As we move through the presentation, you will hear the term post-secondary planning, which is also the name of tonight's presentation, many times. We use this term to talk about life after high school. How will your student spend their time when they aren't in school for a 6-block day? The answer to this question might stir up many feelings for you and for your student. Maybe excited, nervous, scared, unsure, or maybe very sure. The main theme woven throughout the evening is that we as counselors are here to support both your student and yourselves. We'll quite literally be with your student from now until graduation, and in very certain circumstances, even after that. In the next slide, and the slide after that, I will talk about some of the different options students have for after high school. Then we will discuss the college planning calendar, how to find the right college fit, the importance of college visits, and on-campus or at Ridge rep visits, different components of the college application, everyone's favorite topic, standardized testing, important terms to be aware of and just know, how to use Naviance during this process, and finally, what comes next after this presentation, and some action items for yourself and your student. Before we jump into the different pathways, we want to take a minute to stress the importance that there is no perfect path or perfect place. Each of the 437 students in the class of 2024 are different. Their process will be different, their goals are different, and their story is different. There is no expectation that your student should have all the answers tonight, or even next week, or maybe even 3 months from now. This is a journey, and making decisions like this takes some time. So if you look at this slide, you can see a number of words on the screen. Here at Ridge, four-year colleges are the most popular post-secondary or post-high school option for our students. However, this is not the only option that exists after high school. Some students might find a two-year college, or more commonly known as a community college, a better option for a variety of reasons. Some of these factors might include future career goals, financial reasons, maybe not wanting to live away from home just yet, or having to work while at the same time attending school. Students can attend community college for up to 2 years, obtain an associate's degree, and transfer to a 4-year college or university to then obtain their bachelor's degree. Some students may want to pursue a technical or vocational training in a specific field. When I think of technical or vocational training, I think about the plumber that came to my house when I had a flood in my basement. Other examples of trades might be an electrician, a landscaper, an auto mechanic, an HVAC installer, a painter, or etc. Other students might find a gap year a better fit. How students spend their time during a gap year looks different for each student depending on their individual need at that time. Pursuing a military career or serving in any branch of the United States military may be something your student is already thinking about. Here at Ridge, we are fortunate enough to have Ms. Muraview as our own military liaison. She can work with students interested in learning more about military options. Lastly, students may want to enter the workforce immediately after graduation. No matter what pathway your student chooses, we are ready to work and walk alongside them throughout the entire process. I'm going to now hand over the presentation to Ms. Coviello, who is going to talk about the college planning calendar.
Hello, everyone. So the college planning calendar. So this is a rough outline for what the year will look like and the timeframes that we suggest. Students will be at various steps in the process at different times, and that is totally fine. You have this entire year to do research, and how you plan that out is ultimately up to you. Planning ahead does help, though. You will notice that visiting colleges is listed as a summer activity. However, you may visit at any time throughout the year. We do recommend that you visit if possible, or if you can take a virtual tour online. So either in person or a virtual if the school's, across the country. So gaining familiarity with the campus and its surroundings helps decide if you like a school or not. So start to think about this year, maybe taking advantage of some weekends, if you can, get out of the house and visit a school, or take advantage of spring break that's coming up to maybe visit at a school that's farther away. So planning ahead in that way so you don't commit just this summer to maybe search for schools and visit the campus. 2 weeks ago, counselors met with all juniors during a mandatory post-secondary planning presentation where we introduced similar information, as well as a post-secondary planning handbook. That provides videos and printed information for students and families, and it's available on our counseling department website and our post-secondary counseling website. For students who took the PSAT in October, they should be receiving that email shortly from College Board, providing them with a code to access their PSAT scores. The PSAT scores are also posted on Naviance as well, but colleges won't see those scores. Later this winter, we are excited to meet with all juniors to discuss senior year scheduling and begin individual conversations about their post-secondary planning. Counselors refer to these meetings as junior conferences. And each junior will have a conference with their counselor. During this conference, students have the opportunity to speak with their counselor about their post-secondary plans, ask any questions that they may have about the post-secondary planning process, and also receive feedback and instructions for future planning from their counselor. Please note that during senior year, students will also work very closely with their counselors to ensure that they understand the whole process. Finding the right fit. So we are recommending that your students start thinking about some of these items now. Students do not need to have all the answers, and some answers may change as they may move through the process, and that's okay. These questions just help students to begin to start to think about what they may be interested in, and will help them to narrow the search down the line when they start making those final decisions on where they'll be applying to. When considering fit, students should begin thinking about certain factors, including their own academic fit, such as their GPA, standardized test scores if necessary, desired major, maybe specific majors that they're interested in as well, such as teaching or psychology, the cost of the school, the distance from home or desired location. Do they want to commute from home and live at home, or visit on the weekends, so they will only be like a couple hours away? So weighing those options are important to think about. Also, career interests and self-reflecting about how they learn best in an environment, such as maybe they don't want a huge state school with 50 students or 100 students in the classroom, or a smaller professor to student ratio, where they can have more one-on-one time with a teacher. And even desired student life activities. Do they have maybe certain programs that they want, sports, clubs or activities? Just the general feel of the school is important to think of. So to begin searching for colleges that fit those criteria, students are able to search for college utilizing a variety of factors in Naviance. To do so, students would go to colleges on the Naviance homepage. You're going to be hearing Naviance a lot in this presentation. So in the top right corner of their Naviance homepage. And us counselors will help the students as well in their junior conferences, maybe navigating that. Oops. I did not realize I was doing that. Okay. And having like a super match where they would put in different factors of a school, such as the distance, the cost of the school, putting specific majors in, and it'll come up with a list of schools on Naviance that meet those certain factors or criteria. So it's a super helpful resource. And it's also a wonderful way of expanding a student's list and alerting them of other colleges that they might not have initially thought of or even knew that were out there. Other ways to find lesser known colleges could be utilizing the website Colleges That Change Lives, and that's derived from a book by Lauren Pope, and also by speaking to your student's counselor. You know, have them reach out to us. Maybe certain schools we can recommend to them or talk about what they're interested in, and maybe we can give some recommendations as well. So campus visits and virtual tours. We do recommend that students visit in person if possible at the college's campus, or they can take a virtual tour online. Gaining familiarity with the campus and its surroundings helps them decide if they like the school or not, because you can feel completely different stepping on the campus instead of just looking at the school's website. We are fortunate to live in an area where we are surrounded by a multitude of colleges, including large state institutions, mid-sized schools, and smaller liberal art colleges. Students can still drive around campuses to get an idea of the setting for local campuses, and many schools have provided virtual tours on their websites and access to college rep sessions via Zoom or other virtual platforms. And it's always a good practice just to look at the college's website. That's where they'll have the tours, or that's where they'll have the majors, and all like specific information about the school. Okay, college visits at Ridge High School as well. So, visits occur in the fall each year, and this year they continue until mid-December. During these visits, students get the opportunity to learn more about a particular college and meet an admissions rep that can answer any specific questions the student may have. As long as the student is signed up for the visit in advance, they'll be given a pass on Genesis and be excused from class. So to do that, they will sign up via Naviance again, and that's on the homepage as well. It's usually on like the right-hand side. These visits are either virtual or in person, and they will both be conducted in the media center. So it's a great resource to talk to admission reps and ask specific questions one-on-one to a rep. So Next, we have Mr. Biankowski that's going to take it from here.
All right, so last month, the kids had the opportunity to take the PSATs at Ridge High School. So when those test scores come in, they will get an email from the email they used when they registered. Once they get the email, they can create a College Board account to view the test scores. So the PSAT is just practice. Colleges will never see them. They don't send those scores. It gives kids an idea of how they can do on the SAT. We recommend that students begin testing after they have a chance to review the PSAT scores and continue through the spring, summer. However, it's up to your student schedule when they can take the SATs, whether they play sports in the winter or spring, and if they do, let's say they do winter sport, they might take it in the spring or vice versa. So it's up to your child's free schedule when they can take the test. If they want to be recruited to a school for sports, they might want to take the test early to give college coaches scores so they can help them through the recruitment process as well. To register for the SAT, they will go on College Board. To register for the ACT, they will go on the ACT website. So students will ask us which test to take. There is no harm in taking both. We recommend they take one of each type of test. If they took the PSAT in October, they can take the ACT or practice ACT and get a feel of which test they feel that they did better on. Once they have done that, they can compare scores and consider which test they want to take and sign up for. So even before the COVID-19 pandemic, some schools were becoming test optional, meaning if a student did not choose to send test scores, they would not be held against them. But now, as the COVID pandemic came through in the last 2 years, and even now, more schools have become more test optional or test blind. Test blind means if they do send test scores, they won't have an advantage over other students. To prepare for standardized testing, they can take a course or get tutoring. We also provide a website called Methodize that can help students take practice tests, which is on Naviance, which gives them 2 free SATs or 2 free ACT tests. Students will get feedback about why, the answer they chose is incorrect. So it's a good practice well for the students. Most colleges superscore the SAT, so that means if they take the SAT multiple times, colleges will take the highest scores of reading and math. So if they, whether one score is higher than the other score or lower than the other score, the highest test scores in each category, regardless of the test, will be counted. And some schools might superscore the ACT, which is the same thing, depending on the highest score for each of the tests they took. But when students are applying to schools, they have to look at the school's testing policy. And for the test of English as a foreign language or Duolingo, if students didn't do all 4 years of high school in America, colleges might recommend they take this test to prove their English proficiency. All right, so components of the application. The heart of the application is your child's transcript. This tells colleges your child's 4-year academic journey at Ridge High School. When students begin applying, colleges will only see the final year grade of freshman, sophomore, and junior year. After they apply, they might see marking period 1 grades. We do send those grades out unless students request not to send those grades in. But if colleges want marking period 1 grades, we do send them. So if students worry about not having a good marking period junior year, they have the other 3 marking periods to balance it out. And they will also have the GPA of each academic year as well. Standardized tests, as I said, if your child does want to send SAT or ACT scores, that is part of the application. School profile data, so this gives colleges more background information on Ridge High School, tells us what courses we offer, the grades students get in each class, so that way if a kid let's say gets a C+ in science, they can constantly like, okay, what's a C+ really mean in the context of Ridge High School? The curriculum, so colleges will see what classes your child took and what courses Ridge High School has to offer, but it's important for your child to take classes that are best suited for them. Personal essays, so when they start applying to colleges, colleges will have essays on either Common App or their own supplemental essays. This gives students the opportunity to tell colleges about themselves, who they are as a student, or an athlete, or something in their personal lives. Letters of recommendations, we tell the students to start asking teachers in the spring. To teachers, if they would write their letters of recommendations, we recommend that they ask their junior year teachers. And the reason why we ask them to ask teachers in the spring is because teachers might only write so many letters, so that way they can start asking teachers. Special skills and talents, so they're going to look at, besides academics, what your child does, whether it's sports, clubs, volunteer, work. For GPA, we might have a different GPA scaling than other schools, so colleges might recalculate GPA based on their system to more fairly compare it to GPAs across the application pool. All right, and I will pass it over to Ms. Hughes for more college vocabulary and more college stuff.
Good evening. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about some more vocabulary that's going to be important within this whole college application process, as well as a little bit more about Naviance, which is something you guys are going to run into a lot in the next year and a half. And then I will finish off with some takeaways, and then we'll move to our questions. So the first set of vocabulary that I want to talk about is the different admissions policies that colleges sometimes offer. And this is important because ultimately it is up to you and your student which one of these policies they're going to decide to apply under. So we want to give a general idea of what they all mean. The first one I want to talk about is early decision. And early decision is typically one of the earlier deadlines, and it is a binding deadline. And what that means is that when a student applies early decision, they are committing to attend that school if they're accepted. And so we typically advise students who are either very interested or very sure of where they want to go to apply in this matter if they want to, but with the understanding that they are committing to that school if they're accepted. So it is binding. That is different than early action, although they're usually around the same time of year, sometime in November. But early action is not binding. It's just an early deadline. Students will get their paperwork in sooner, and they will have an answer sooner. But they are not required to attend that school if they get accepted to it, and you can apply to multiple schools early action since it's not binding. But you would only be able to apply to one school early decision since it is binding, if that makes sense. There's also regular decision, which is sort of just the standard deadline. That's typically sometime in the winter or early spring for most schools, and that is a later deadline, of course, than those early deadlines. And then another popular sort of format of application is a rolling application. And this one is a type of application where as soon as the college receives all of the information and the application documents for one student, they will immediately start reviewing that application and get back to the student with an answer, usually within 4 to 6 weeks, maybe a little bit longer depending on what time of year it is. So that's really what changes between rolling and regular decision is with those other applications, they're not typically reviewing the application until the actual deadline. So if the deadline is January 1st, for example, a student could get their application in earlier than that, but the college won't actually be looking over it until that deadline. Whereas with rolling, they will start reviewing it as soon as they receive everything in the application. So those are going to be important as students kind of make their list and figure out what deadlines they might be looking at for next year. The next part I want to talk about is types of admissions decisions. And so this is, I'll touch on really quickly because there is a long time until this happens. But it's important for you guys to know sort of like what might happen and what might come up as decisions come back from schools. And so, of course, we have accepted and denied. Those ones kind of speak for themselves. But there are a couple other ones that sometimes students aren't exactly sure of what they mean. So sometimes students get deferred from a college, and what that means is that if they had applied early, that school wasn't able to make a decision on them and will now be deferring their application to the regular decision pool and re-looking at it during that set of applications. That is a little bit different from a wait list, which is also something that sometimes happens to students. And wait list means that the student is admissible based on the criteria for that college, but maybe they don't have room at the time, or maybe they've already offered admission to a certain number of other students. And so they would offer a wait list to students to indicate that maybe they're still interested. And if they have a spot open up, they would reach out and then let that student know. Wait lists aren't always something that students come off of, unfortunately, and so we would recommend that if a student is waitlisted, they do have another school in mind that they are ready to attend if need be. And really quick on financial aid, scholarships, that kind of thing, the most popular financial aid sort of form would be the FAFSA. Most people have probably heard of that at least a little bit. And that is a form that will be filled out by both the parent and the student. There is no rush. It's not available until the October 1st of the student's senior year. So it has come out just recently for the seniors of this year, and it will be out October 1st for your student's graduating year. We do recommend that all students fill out the FAFSA, even if you think that your student might not qualify for financial aid. It oftentimes allows colleges to give more flexibility in terms of merit money or scholarships to students, since they have that background information about the finances. So even if you're like thinking, not sure if we really want to do that, we do recommend that every student takes a little bit of time to fill out that FAFSA if they can. Another sort of similar thing to the FAFSA is the CSS profile. It's a little bit different in terms of what questions it's going to ask parents and students. And we really see this more for smaller or private institutions, but sometimes we have students and parents who are wondering, is this legitimate? Is this something that we do have to do? And there are schools that require the CSS profile. So based on whatever the school's particular website says, you might be doing one, the other, or both of them. Lastly, scholarships. There are plenty of scholarships out there, and we are frequently updating our Naviance page that is in reference to scholarships. We have local scholarships on there, or anything that we feel might be appropriate for our students. So as students kind of go through senior year, a good place to check is that scholarships tab on Naviance. Okay. So another important kind of set of vocabulary is talking about how we designate schools for students, and oftentimes we use the words safety, target, and reach. And this sort of helps students build their list of schools, if that makes sense. Coming up with a balanced list, which I'll get to, is very important. And so we will use kind of these designations oftentimes to talk to students. So I will start with safety school, and a safety school is a school where a student in particular exceeds the academic profile of that school. So their GPA, their test score, if they're choosing to send those, is well above what a particular school typically accepts. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the future, but our Naviance, which is a great tool that we have, does show these GPA and test score statistics in reference to students from Ridge that have applied to these schools in the past. So it's really helpful to look at that and kind of see where your student maybe falls compared to other students from Ridge. So a safety school would be somewhere where you are like, yes, it looks a lot like my student will get in here. We feel very comfortable about this. They're above what this school is looking for. A target school is a college where the student's academic profile matches up just right with that test score and GPA. So it's right in that target range. It's looking like they meet the criteria that these schools typically accept. And then with reach schools, that would be a school where a student is below what that college is looking for in terms of test score, in terms of GPA. And typically, we also advise students that any school that has under a 30% acceptance rate also would be considered a reach school, just simply because of the numbers of it all. 30% acceptance rate or lower is very competitive in general. And so for any student, even if you are right in line with what they're looking for, we often would consider that a reach school as well. So like I mentioned, Naviance is a great tool. It's a web-based resource that we use a lot of times, and we're going to use it a lot more to assist students in making their post-secondary plans. All students were emailed a code to register for Naviance, as well as parents, over the last couple of years. But if you didn't receive yours or your student didn't receive theirs, just make sure that they reach out to either the counseling office secretary or the school counselor that they're working with, and we can help get them set up. We began working with you guys or your students last year as sophomores to explore a little bit about different career paths. There are some really great surveys in Naviance that students can take to learn about their personality types, their learning style, and what careers might fit them in the future. So we touched on that a little bit with students last year, but Naviance is going to become even more relevant over the next year and a half or so with our students. It's a great resource, as Ms. Coviello said, for the search process. You are able to search based on a lot of different factors, location, size, cost, etc. And students often are able to match with colleges or even sometimes receive messages or notifications from colleges that meet the criteria of what they might be looking for. So it's a really great place to start. And like I mentioned before, the data stored in Naviance, there are loads of data points that have relevance to Ridge students who have graduated within the last few years, including kind of like what their admissions looked like, what particular student statistics are that maybe were accepted or were not accepted from a certain college. And so it can be really helpful because it's school-specific data. So I'm going to play a really quick clip for you guys demonstrating some of the important pieces of Naviance.
So, now that we've told you a little bit about Naviance, I'm going to show you where you can find some of these resources once you're logged in. Right now, I am logged in through our sample student account. So there are some features that are only accessible through the student account, and if you're in the parent account, you may not see these features on there. So if we scroll down to the bottom, there is a link down here for Method Test Prep. This is a program students can use to prepare for the SAT or ACT on their own. It has sample lessons, quizzes, and full-length tests that students can take. And we recommend registering using the same login information as Naviance just so that they remember how to log into that program. If we go back up to the top, there are specific links up here for certain sections. So under self-discovery, this is where you'll find some inventories that students can take. The Career Interest Profiler is something that students take during their sophomore year. Under careers, students can use this to explore certain clusters or specific careers, and it's a way students can look for schools that might have majors related to a career that they're interested in. Under the colleges section, this is where students will be working from a lot during their junior year with the college search, as well as applying to college during their senior year. So under applying to college, if a student has test scores that are sent to us through ACT or College Board, they'll find this information here. Scholarship list is a great place to look at scholarships that are available, as well as special programming. So there may be some things that are of interest to students before their senior year. So it's something that is definitely good to look at. Under college visits, this is where students will sign up for those visits that happen in the media center. So we do still have a few for this year, and then we do have these visits starting again in the fall of their senior year. Over in Find Your Fit, this is where students can do college searches. Through the advanced college search, students can select certain qualifiers to help come up with a list. So some of the things here would be looking for a four-year school. Let's say they know they would like a city atmosphere. They can select those qualifiers. And then if they know they want to be in the New England and Mid-Atlantic region, they can select that. And if they hit view matches, this shows 274 schools, but there's also qualifiers for size of school and major that can help narrow down this list a little bit more. So if we take a look at a specific profile, like American, this is where students can find information that's specific to that university. There will be a link to their own website, which is the resource that students should be using to look at things like policies for the application and things that need to be included, as well as the application deadline dates. They'll also be able to find information pertaining to the size of school, what type of location it's in, and more specifically, under the admissions section, students can look at a scattergram, which includes information about Ridge High School students that applied to this school and whether they were accepted, which would be the green check marks. If they were denied, those are the red X's, and then the little circles are students who were waitlisted or deferred, and the key can be seen down here. So if a student's looking at this scattergram, they can take a peek at where they fall to kind of help gauge if it's a safety, a target, or a reach school. And this is something that they can certainly talk to their school counselor about. If you have any trouble logging in, please reach out to the secretaries in the department and they can help set you up.
So that was just a little bit of a look at some of the most important features of Naviance. Of course, if you or your student has any questions about how to use any of the features or what things that might be helpful for, we are here to help you with all of that. But of course, you can always reflect back on this slide in the video that we have linked if you need kind of a reference on how to find any of those important pieces. So I know we've presented a lot of information at you tonight, and we wanted to leave off with just a couple of takeaways and things to think about for junior year. Of course, a lot of these things are somewhat far away, or at least they feel a little bit far away. And wherever your student is, if they haven't even thought about this, if they think about this all the time, they're in the right spot. There is no correct or incorrect place to be at this point, but we do want to just give some ideas on things that you and your student might want to be thinking about over the course of their junior year, just to make sure that they're prepared for whatever they choose to do after high school. So the first and most important one would just be exploring the different options of what's available to them after high school and seeing what might be the best fit. Whether that is attending a 2-year school or a 4-year school or pursuing the military or a gap year, whatever it may be, this is the time to kind of start kicking around those ideas and seeing what might fit best for your student. If your student does plan to take standardized testing, I know Mr. Biankowski mentioned that standardized testing might not be necessary at every single college at this point because they do have test optional policies, but it's usually best if students are planning to apply to four-year schools to at least have taken a standardized test in the case that they might need it. And so we recommend that you kind of take this time to develop a standardized testing plan, at least to have an idea of when your student might take a test, what tests maybe they might take, and what time of year would work best for them based on their schedule and when they're the busiest. We also recommend that students start thinking, at least in general, about what teachers they might ask for letters of recommendation in the future. They do not need to ask teachers right now. This is typically something that we work with students on in the spring, but starting to get an idea of who they have that relationship with and who might be able to speak to who they are as a student and a person, that's a good thing to start thinking about right now. Number 4, and I hope we helped a little bit with this tonight, is just familiarizing yourself with college admissions vocabulary, technology, and all of those things that might come into play within the next year and a half or so, like Naviance, and also kind of just learning what available resources there are, like virtual tours, info sessions, in-person tours, etc. And lastly, we of course recommend that you attend any Ridge High School Counseling Department sponsored events. We know you guys are here tonight. We're so thankful for that. And what we have in the future, there are many events for both parents and students coming up. We work with students really heavily starting this spring throughout their senior year, and there will be more events and such for you guys as we progress through this year and next year as well. So I just wanted to reiterate, we are here to support you and your student, of course. So if you have questions, we will take some tonight, but of course, if there are any that are more specific to your student or you don't get an opportunity to ask, feel free to email us, call us, anything like that. We are happy to set up a time to talk and answer any questions you might have about this process or any of the options that your student has for after high school. So thank you so much. I am actually going to pass the mic off to Mrs. Trainer and Ms. Kukuro to take some questions.
Good evening. Before we get started with part 2 of our night, I want to thank my colleagues for sharing all of that wonderful information. We hope that you found it helpful. So we're going to take a minute. I just want to do some quick introductions to the team who will be answering questions. So I'm Mrs. Trainer. On the other side of the aisle, I have Mrs. Kukuro. Up front, we have Ms. Wu answering some questions. And then also a special shout out tonight to Ms. Cahill, who will not only be fielding questions tonight as a school counselor, but also as a parent of a junior as well. So she really understands exactly how you feel, and we have her expertise as a school counselor as well. So please go ahead, raise your hands. We do have a couple of questions sent in through our email, so thank you for anybody who's emailed some questions ahead of time. So just please, raise your hand. We'll give you the mic. You can ask your question. Do we have any? We got some questions. Okay, here we go.
Thank you. This is very informative. The question that I had was on the early decision. What happens if a student changes their mind? I mean, you said it's binding, but is there a penalty? Do they never get to go to college after that? What happens?
Good question, really good question. All right, we're going to hand that one over to Ms. Cahill to kick it off.
Okay, so, the question is about early decision. It's binding, so what do you do if your student changes their mind? That's an interesting question. So I guess what I would say is that the goal is that they've spoken to not only their school counselor, but their parents, and that they really are pretty firm in their decision, that they're not only applying early decision, but that they're prepared to withdraw all the other applications once they have heard from their early decision school. So really one of the only things that is likely to impact that decision and that they probably could withdraw from the early decision process for is a change in financial circumstances. Other than that, colleges are pretty much expecting that once you confirm and you sign this document and your parent signs the document and your counselor signs the document, you are confirmed that you'll be attending if accepted. Does it mean there are no ways of getting out of it? Not necessarily, but is it a good look? Not necessarily. So, I mean, certainly that is not the ideal process. So I would definitely say that if you have a student who doesn't seem that they are firm in their approach to an early decision application, that it is best to hold off and not apply early decision. Some schools actually have early decision 1 and early decision 2, and I've recommended to some of my students that they consider holding off and waiting until that January deadline for their early decision process if they really want to know about some of the other schools. Then they have the opportunity to apply early action or rolling decision to those beginning schools, gives them a little bit more time and a little bit more perspective, so then they can hopefully make a better choice when it comes to that early decision commitment.
All right, so show of hands. I think I saw one over here. Ms. Cooper. Okay, never mind, I'll grab it.
Can you elaborate on the events that will be held in the future for similar topics on counseling on college applications, and what kind of sessions will be? Will be like essay kind of guidance? I have no idea. I didn't apply in American colleges, so.
Okay, great question.
Okay, so the question was just in terms of some of the other events and activities that we have planned. So in terms of formal presentations this year, we do have a presentation in April for students who may have like learning disability or 504 and are kind of looking at planning for, you know, colleges and understanding how to research for schools under those circumstances. And then going into your son or daughter's senior year, we do a lot of presentations again. So within the first week of school, typically we have a presentation with our seniors to kind of go over the whole college process in school and talk about like the application at that time and the things that they'll have to do to apply during their senior year. And we have that same presentation at night for parents to attend as well. In terms of just preparing too as we go along before then, as we mentioned previously, we have the junior conference, which happens in March through April, and we will each meet individually with our seniors, and we'll talk about senior year scheduling at that point to kind of determine what classes they'll be taking in relation to, you know, majors or schools that they may be thinking of at that point. And then we also do explore the whole college process and what they're thinking. If they need help researching for schools and looking for schools to add to their list, or maybe, you know, they're just starting and have a lot of questions just to begin, we'll kind of go over all of that during that conference. But just because, you know, we have the conference or those specific presentations doesn't mean that we're not answering questions at any other time. So if things do come up, you can always, you know, reach out to us or explore our website to look at all of our presentations and the information found on there. Typically with the essays, so most English classes do work on that during the beginning of senior year. So a lot of the teachers will work with students, like some teachers have Friday workshops where they'll let students work on those essays and, you know, provide feedback. They'll usually set up meetings with them. As counselors, you know, we can take a look at their essays too to kind of go over it with them. Some students will come into the school year with a draft, and then we can, you know, review that with them as well.
Just to kind of add to that statement too, I think like one of the biggest takeaways as a parent to know is that whatever layer of support or how much support you need, it is available to you and your child. So if this is a new process for anybody or it's not, but it's still really confusing, you have like a team of counselors. Your counselor can help with that process. Your student can come see your counselor, their counselor. There's literally a lot of support available, but every student needs different things. Some students need a lot and some don't need as much. But whatever your student needs or your family needs, it's available to you. You just have to ask. So hopefully that helps too. Okay, great. Do we have a question? Okay, Ms. Kukuro?
Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, I do have a question about the recommendation letters. Is that 2 letters required? Is like one must from like a STEM side teacher, the other is from like a humanity class teacher, or it really doesn't matter? You talk about junior class. Is that possible? Student ask for like a sophomore teacher to write letters, or need to be provided by junior year teachers? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually typically talk with students a little bit during the junior conference about who they're planning on asking for letters of recommendation. So I would say typically we recommend that students have connected with 2 different teachers because some schools are still requiring 2 letters of recommendation. However, sometimes those 2 letters could be a teacher letter and the counselor letter as well. So what we encourage students to do as they're starting to do their college research and starting to put together their list of schools that they're interested in, looking at how many of their schools consider letters of recommendation, how many letters of recommendation. In terms of the question about should you have one from a STEM field and then maybe one from a humanities field, I think that the best general advice to provide a student is try to have 2 people who are going to talk about different aspects of who you are. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be one from a STEM and one from a humanities, but think about the idea that are the 2 people that I'm asking going to have virtually the same feedback? So are the classes that I took from those people similar in nature? Are they going to talk maybe about the same types of things that they've seen from me? And if the answer to that is yes, then maybe you want to consider a different person to write that other letter so that it kind of captures other aspects of who you are. The other thing that I always really encourage my students to consider is that I think students tend to gravitate towards teachers where they're like, well, I did well in that class. Ironically, when you do well in a subject, it might mean that that's a subject where you didn't go in for extra help and you didn't necessarily speak as much with your teacher. So, you also want to think maybe a little bit outside the box about who you're going to ask, that maybe it's sometimes better to actually ask a teacher in a class in which you actually had to struggle to get the grade than it is to just ask 2 teachers in classes where you happen to be the rock star. So sometimes it's better to have a teacher who can talk about what do you do when you encounter a challenge. The likelihood that you're going to get through the rest of your education never encountering a challenge is fairly unlikely, so it's actually helpful to have not only the feedback from a person who maybe is going to say, they really didn't need me for anything, versus the letter where maybe they can talk more about that process of how that student was able to work through those challenges. So there are occasionally students who will apply for a program where the program itself requests letters from a particular area. So when you were mentioning, like, should you always have one from a STEM and one from humanities, there may be instances in which a student is applying to a school where the school specifies, we'd like to make sure that you've asked a teacher from the following field. So I would say it's then incumbent upon that student to have done that research. What does that school require? And then what is that student providing in terms of letters of recommendation?
This is also a good time to talk about checking individual college websites. We ran into this a lot this year with our seniors. Each school, and you're going to hear us, when you ask questions, a lot of it is going to be, well, it depends on the college. I mean, we must say that like 500 times a day. But checking the school's websites to see what exactly they require. So if they're saying we require 2 academic letters, that means 2 teachers. Even though we here as school counselors work in the school, we don't teach your students, so that doesn't count as academic. So we always encourage students and parents, look at the actual websites, go through their application checklist, see what they're asking for specifically so that you're clear on what each school wants, or as Ms. Cahill says, if there's a particular program that is saying we need a STEM and a humanities, that you will be aware that that is the case and not missing anything.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, we have a question right here.
Certain schools require that the counselor writes a recommendation. So I'm going to put the spotlight on you guys and say, you do not know the students. You do not connect with them as the teachers do. What happens in this case? How do you assess what a letter could look like? Because that may have a go, no-go impact on the final decision making. So what do you guys do to do that? How do you get to know a student if the student hasn't spent time with you?
That's a good question, and I think that each of us probably has a different relationship with every student, within our caseload, since we do work with grades 9 through 12. I think that also provides us with an opportunity where, we are working with the student each year and maybe are kind of gaining some insight through, like, even those small instances. I think a lot of us do kind of get a lot of information, whether it be during our, freshman, sophomore meetings, or when we meet with all the students for scheduling. During the end of their junior year, we actually have something called the senior packet, which each of the students will fill out. And that includes a lot of information about what they've done throughout high school, activities that they're involved in. It's all questions about themselves. We do also include a portion which is called the parent brag sheet, where you guys get to include things that you feel are important from throughout their time in high school. And then during their senior year, we do meet with them all individually again. And I think for students where we may not have as much information as we do with certain, students, that is also a time where, we look at like the packet and we'll see the information that they've written and kind of go over things that they've done throughout high school and expand on some of what they've written there. Also just generally asking them questions about things that, they may feel are important to, and kind of get more information when we are meeting with them there as well.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a couple of questions up here.
I want to add to what Ms. Wu just said. So I think the other thing that is really important is to turn that around a little on your child and say, how well do you know your counselor? How often have you gone to see your counselor? So, we work with kids for 4 years. I would really encourage students, if they feel like we don't know them very well, this is a great opportunity for them to come in and formulate more of a relationship. I would argue that you could have a teacher for an entire year, several days a week, and still not necessarily formulate a relationship. So I think it's really important to put that sort of onus on your students. So now comes the time where you're starting to talk about things like, okay, so we're putting together this application for you. Who's writing your letters of recommendation? So you're getting a counselor letter, because we write for every one of our students. Do you know your counselor well? How well do they know you? How often have you gone in to chit chat and tell them things about yourself? I have some kids that come in weekly and sit in my office and chat with me. I have other kids that are like, we can meet when it's time to schedule. That's okay too. I mean, I don't push myself on students, but I think it's something that's important for them to consider, that we are someone who's going to write a letter of recommendation. So are their teachers. So the idea of who are you asking? How well do they know you? How often have you gone in? Do you want to start maybe thinking about formulating more of a relationship? We actually told that to students when we talked to them about letters of rec. Think about who you're going to ask. And if right now you're sitting there and being like, I don't know who I'm going to ask because I don't feel like anyone really knows me all that well. Maybe I'm really quiet in my classes. Okay, cool. So you have between now and the end of the school year to make more of an impression. So now is the time for you to do that. So I would definitely say that is something to consider saying to your student. How often have you gone in? How much do you think that your counselor knows you? We will have that junior conference where we do talk a lot specifically about them and what their process is going to be. And then again in that senior meeting, but definitely, relationships are a two-way street. So I think that's something really important to consider.
Great, thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the slides that was shown had data about how students get accepted in a college, basically from Ridge, and there was a GPA score and what was accepted, not accepted. Now, it was clear that there are some students with lower GPA that got accepted and students with higher GPA did not, and some were deferred. So obviously there is differentiating factors each college look at. So when we look at this data in Naviance, is there any additional information like that available to say that, okay, these are the criteria, these are the GPAs, and then these are some of the other differentiating factors for which the students got selected, or is that something we have to figure out? Is there any data already available? That was my question.
Okay, so there's not necessarily a list from schools, with the other factors that they're looking at. One of our other slides had that graphic with the transcript in the middle and all the other factors that are considered. So a lot of schools, when you are hearing their presentations, will talk about their admissions process being a holistic, review of the students. So they're looking beyond just the transcript with the GPA and the test scores. So some of those students on the graph could have some of those other, outlier factors, like if they're an athlete or there's a certain major that they're looking at, or, whatever other things that may come into play when they're reviewing their applications from students. Some schools, too, may have certain things that they're looking to do in terms of building their class. They're not looking at admitting a class of everybody who has the same profile. They want to, build a specific class. So there may be things that they're looking at, and that's what they're finding when they're reading those applications. And the other thing too, in terms of Naviance with the scatograms, they're a great resource in terms of gauging if a school is a safety, a target, and things like that. One of the reasons that there might be an outlier on there as well is because you can actually change the graphs to show your SAT or ACT scores, and since students can submit SAT or ACT scores to schools or no scores at all, those graphs don't factor that stuff out. So, you may be seeing a student who was admitted on the SAT graph, but they actually submitted their ACT score, which maybe was much higher. Or maybe they went test optional and didn't submit scores at all. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Those graphs are really good in terms of just helping with gauging, but there are some of those other factors that aren't, added in there. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think this is why we're still in business, is that, you can look at the graphs and you get certain information, but you also have to know things like some schools have recently gone test optional, or some schools we saw an incredible increase in the applicant pool in a particular year, and that had an impact on the number of students that school was willing to take from our school, for example. We also occasionally have reps that come in and tell us things like, so, we're in a little bit of trouble in our state funding, we need to take more in-staters and less out-of-staters, and you're like, oh, surprise, so now a little late in the game, but that school is not going to be taking as many out-of-state applicants. So there's certain information that counselors will glean from reps, from our own visits, from our own conversations, even from our own experience from the previous year, where we can shed some light for students on some of the things that seem like they don't really make a lot of sense, to talk maybe about what some of those specifics are and why we might be seeing that in a particular graph. It's also helpful to understand that, there are different acceptance plans that students are sometimes given. So for example, there are some schools that will say, well, you're accepted, but it's like a conditional acceptance and you have to go abroad for a semester, or, it's a spring acceptance. And there are certain things that students are not able to see in a graph, but we are able to see when we dive a little bit deeper into that admissions information. So I would say that this is why we sit down with students in both their junior conference when they're initially making their list, and then again also during their senior meeting, to talk a little bit more specifically about where they're applying, when they're applying, whether or not they have enough safety schools, whether or not we agree with them about whether something is a target. So that's why it's really important that they are in communication with us, because we can shed some light sometimes on a graph that may appear one way, and we might say, well, that is the case. However, moving forward, we're going to see a change and a swing in terms of what that admissions profile will look like in future years.
Okay, great. We'll come over here.
So other than like the GPA and the SAT and ACT scores, is there something our juniors should be doing at the moment to make themselves look better on the applications, meaning clubs, summer employment, pre-college programs, all the stuff that's going around? Is it better to have something on your, your resume for what you did each summer, other than being a beach bum or something like that? Like, how can they make that part, the non-academic part, I guess, look more appealing to the colleges that they're applying to?
This is like the quintessential question of like, what are all the things that I can do? So I think that always the most important thing is to be genuine. So you want your student to do the things that are their things. It becomes actually really evident in an application when you have a student who's doing all the things and probably therefore none of the things, if you know what I mean. Like, you can't do all of those things well, so clearly then you didn't. So I think when you have people who are genuine and they do certain things because they love them, that comes out in an application. So we always get the question as counselors, like, what do I do in the summer? Like, is there some like important program that I can do that makes me look like especially amazing compared to all of my peers? And the answer to that question is like, no, there probably isn't. There's many programs that you could do over the summer. You also could be the kind of kid who has a job every single summer, and maybe every summer you've even been promoted in that job. So I think it just really depends on who the child is and how they're going to appear in an application. And typically, when they are genuine and they act like themselves and they pick the things that make sense for them, that really does come across. I think if you have a student who hasn't found their thing, and maybe they need a little bit of help being like, okay, what should I do with my time? That's a really good conversation, not only to be having with you, but to come in and kind of say, like, I don't know if I've really found like my niche at Ridge. Like, what are some of the clubs that we have that maybe I haven't done? I think students have a tendency to go to the things that their friends do in the beginning. It's like freshman year and everyone's like, wait, you're going to that thing at lunch? Oh, I'll go to that thing at lunch. And then sometimes they get sucked in and it's a really good thing that they did. And other times they're like looking for what their thing is going to be because they didn't really find it if they kind of followed people to whatever, thing that they did. So I think that's an important concept now as a junior, is to really start thinking about, like, what have I done? Do I really think that it reflects like who I am as a person, what my personality is, what my interests are, what I enjoy? It doesn't mean it has to relate to what you're going to do in the future. I mean, how many of you have, pastimes that are not what you do as a career? So it doesn't mean that that is the thing that the kid is going to major in, but do they have things that they've explored that they really love? And we don't do a ton of interviews for students at this point anymore. A lot of colleges have kind of been shying away from those, but let's just assume that they were in an interview situation and someone were to say to them, so what things have you done? Like, what experiences have you had that you really think like kind of mark your high school experience? And if their answer is like, I don't know, then that's what they need to be looking for, right? So it's not any one particular thing, it's what their particular thing is.
I always like to tell students, like, it's not about like one thing you have to do, it's that you do something. And whether it's work or you help out at your, with your family, if you have responsibilities, is that you do something that's meaningful to you so that you can share that with colleges or with a job interview, with whatever it is that you end up doing. Okay, we have a question.
Hey, thank you. When does a student apply for scholarship? And can you talk about different types of scholarships that are available in terms of like, non-financial, but not just from college, specific college, or from national merit? I think it's an underused tool probably by students and parents. I think shining some light on this process probably will be helpful.
So in terms of scholarships, one resource, as we mentioned, was like the scholarship list on Naviance. That list is updated throughout the year, so that will include scholarships that we get information for. Some of them will be national scholarships, some of them are more local scholarships. The more local scholarships that are posted on there typically get posted starting in like December of their senior year, and then through like March, the monetary amount will differ. And for those will typically really just apply to when they're senior. They should be looking at those. But if you look at the scholarship list now, there are some smaller awards that do apply prior to their senior year, and then there are websites. If you look on our counseling department website, we have a link for different search engines where you can look at other scholarships that are available, which may or may not have financial need as a requirement. And right now, a lot of schools too, I think, do automatically consider students as part of the application. So you may not necessarily have to do a separate application. That's, not every school, but some schools do that, which is nice because then you don't have to, check off or add anything additional to it. And then just in terms of, I know this is a little bit more financial need-based, but we do also have a financial aid presentation that will happen next year that, could be helpful in terms of just finding other resources to look at as well if you're looking, for other scholarships or financial opportunities.
Hi, thank you so much. I just want to know, can parents be a part of the junior conferences or the senior planning conferences they have with the counselors, or is it just the student and the counselor?
So the junior conference and the senior meeting are just the student and the counselor. Part of that was really a shift to making sure that the student really knows that they're the ones who are driving this process. That does not mean, however, that we don't think that parents are important or involved. It more means that it's sometimes more helpful to connect one-on-one with the student during those meetings, and then often I find that either they come in with a list of like, okay, so here are the things that I'm supposed to ask you, and then they go home with the answers, which is also good because then they hear not only the question from you and the answer from us, but then they have to relay it to you, which means that not only do they have to understand it well enough to ask it, they have to understand it well enough to explain it back, which I think is important. But also, we are certainly happy to answer your questions. So if you call or email us, we're happy to respond and answer any questions that you may have. You may find that your questions are different than your students' questions, or that you even want to provide us with some information that maybe your student isn't providing us with. I always think it's super important when parents say things like, hey, listen, I want to let you know that every time I mention college to my student, like they hit the ceiling and I have to peel them down. Like, it's helpful to know that information, and sometimes they don't come in saying that. They may not say, like, this process makes me super anxious, or I'm really worried, or I can barely talk about this. Sometimes just by virtue of how they behave, you can kind of tell that, but sometimes they really put on a pretty good face and you don't really know that they're super worried. So I would say any insight that you can give us about your student, and then any questions that you have are always welcome by us, but we do try to have your student be, the focal point of that conversation during the junior conference, and then again during their senior meeting.
Okay, I have a question going back to recommendation letters. You spoke about having 1 to 2 academic-focused letters. Are colleges also looking for recommendation letters from, say, non-academic extracurricular mentors or leaders, or how does that factor into the application?
Okay, so that is something that, students and parents do ask us quite often in terms of like, can I send extra recommendation letters to schools? And that's one of those questions where we, say it depends on the school. And that's where it's really important to go on that school's website to look at what they're asking for from students. A lot of the schools will outline specifically, whether they want extra recommendation letters, who they want that from, and how to submit those letters. So some schools may say, it's great if you feel like you have somebody else that knows you really well and can add something different than what your teachers are going to be saying, and you want them to submit information for you, go ahead and submit that. Whereas other schools may say, we don't want any extra letters, we just want the one academic and the one counselor, and that's it, we don't look at anything else. So it's really important that you are looking at those websites and following the directions that they're giving in terms of, what they want students to submit. And I would say for the most part, when we hear from college reps, when, letters of recommendations come up, their big thing is always like, why are you submitting that extra letter of recommendation, and what is it going to add to your application? Are you submitting 5 extra letters that are going to say, what recommender number 1 and recommender number 2 said, or are you adding somebody who knows you in a different capacity and can really add something unique and different about you from their experience working with you?
Okay, great, thanks. I'm actually going to take an email question. So the question kind of has to be, refers to course selections in terms of like how colleges view course selections, and specifically it's also asking about like study halls. How are study halls viewed on a transcript and overall class selection?
Okay, well, that's an easy one because study halls are not on a transcript, so that's easy. So, the number of credits a student has earned is on the transcript, so I suppose if you were really like, sneaky and you were gonna like look at each year and be like, well, that student managed to earn 40 credits that year and only 35 credits that year, like, could they figure out the student maybe had a study hall? I mean, they could, assuming that they were figuring out that nuance of our schedule. I don't know that anybody has time in their life for that, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think, listen, as a parent, what I would tell you about study halls is they're valuable for multiple reasons. Sometimes they're valuable because your student actually uses them, like Harkin, they actually do work during their study hall. Sometimes they also go in for extra help during that time. Sometimes that's the time that a kid comes in and hangs out with me and like chit-chats, and again, I think that's valuable time. Sometimes it's the time that they have downtime, so that way when they get home, they can hit the ground running and do all the things that they need to do. So I'm actually like a firm advocate for a study hall, because I think that for a lot of students, they're helpful for just a different, different reason depending upon the student. In terms of course selections and how they view course selections, it's interesting because one of the counselors was worried about the fact that, like we say during the presentation to our juniors, they not only consider what your transcript looks like, they consider what classes we offer. Well, I mean, if you look at our program of studies, that's like a daunting thing to say to a 16-year-old. Like, they're going to compare those two things, but they do. They do look at what classes we offer, what classes students have available to them, and then what classes they select. But they also would look at it if your student selects something that's totally inappropriate for them and falls flat on their face junior or senior year. I mean, you see that come across in a transcript as well. So the most important thing your student can do is try to choose the classes that highlight their strength areas and hopefully don't highlight their weaknesses. And when they encounter something that's a challenge, figure out a way to work through that challenge. So it's not that you're never going to have a class that you don't perform as well as you had hoped you would. I mean, that is probably going to happen to every one of these students, whether it's in high school, in college, potentially in graduate school. So what we're looking for students to be able to do is to choose classes that are appropriate for them, to hopefully enjoy what it is that they're taking, and then to make decisions for the following year based upon what they've done well in and what they enjoy doing, so that they can hopefully move towards college when they have, like, the world is their oyster, right? They can take anything that they want to take in college. It almost is overwhelming in comparison to what it's like in high school when you have a finite number of choices. Your student's senior year is the first year that there's really less prescriptive choices, right? Like, they're actually going to be able to pick which social studies class they want to take, which science class they want to take. Up until this point, they've basically just taken what is the next class in the sequence. So you may find that they are looking at this like wide-eyed, trying to figure out what it is that they want to take for their senior year. It's both exciting to be able to pick what you want to take, and sometimes it's a little daunting to pick what you want to take and, like, make sure that you're picking the right combination. We have some classes that, as counselors, what we talk about is that they're standalone APs. Like, in other words, there is not a course that is below that class. So if they choose that course, there is no level change that is specific to that particular course. So it's really important that they're choosing well during their senior year and that they're using their past performance, their areas of interest, talking to their teachers about classes that they might be interested in. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that class is like? What types of qualities you see in me that you think maybe would be good for that class? What things I maybe should consider working on for the rest of the year in order to be successful in that class? Those are the types of conversations that are really helpful for students to have, because it allows them to choose better during their senior year when they have more of those choices. So I would say, yes, course selections are important, and yes, trying to choose a competitive course schedule is important, but again, one that is competitive for your student and not all of their friends, right? Because what ends up happening is that there's a lot of comparing that happens at this school. There are a lot of really high achieving students, and not everybody can balance a whole bunch of APs with the rest of the things that they do. And you don't want to end up being a student who has to quit all of the things that you love doing simply to take the classes that you took because you thought you needed to take them.
Thank you. I think it's a pretty nice, informative session. Thank you very much for that. I have a question, like, in some of the countries like Canada, there is a common application process. So as I was going through the Naviance, he was going through the video on the Naviance, he was talking about applying for colleges. Is Naviance the only place to apply for colleges, or is there a common app, or you have to apply to the universities directly?
So Naviance actually isn't the piece that you'll use for the actual applications. What we utilize Naviance for during the student's senior year is for sending letters of recommendations from teachers, the transcript, the school profile that we send out, and our counselor letter of recommendation as well. So that's just the avenue with which we send our school documents. It does connect with an application system. So in terms of how you're applying to schools, there actually is a common application for schools. So that's commonapp.org is the website. There's hundreds of schools who are on it, and what that website allows you to do is fill out one application, which will be used to be submitted to 15 schools, let's say, that you're applying to. Each of those schools, however, may have their own separate section that they also need completed as part of their application. So that's one, way that you can apply to schools. Some schools, if they don't utilize Common Application, do have their own application that they might use. So let's say the UC schools in California, for example, they have their own application system that you'll utilize. So that is a piece where if you go onto the school's actual website, you'll see, what you need to use to be able to apply to that school.
And I think that's a really good question about like the application process. And again, students will be applying in their senior year, which we will go through all of that process with you and like what applications you use and how we use Naviance to kind of supplement that. But I thought that was a really good question. But again, the application process, you will actually be completing them in the fall of the senior year. Yeah.
My question is, when you're formulating target schools with students, I know that you used Naviance in terms of data. Do you have any other data that you're using internally from the school itself to say, hey, this may not look right on Naviance, but we have other data internally that we use with the school, that this school meets your criteria and it should be a target, or vice versa?
Sort of. I would say we use experience with particular schools and particular majors, for example, to maybe tell a student that school may not be a target for you, even though they may look like a target, for example, on a graph. So I would say that one of those programs, like specifically, would be like nursing. If you have a nursing student, we automatically know when we look at certain schools that that school's profile on Naviance does not reflect what their applicant pool will look like and their acceptance rate would look like for a student who's applying for nursing. I would say the same thing for certain schools with their business program. Or, it's interesting because it depends sometimes on the program and the school. So I will often say to a student, like, if they say to me, like, oh, Syracuse is my favorite school, it looks like a target for me on the graph, the first question out of my mouth is going to be, are you applying for communications? Because if you're applying for communications, the Newhouse school is not a target for you because it's just not. It's one of the hardest programs to get into at Syracuse, and it's an incredibly competitive program in terms of countrywide. So those are important questions that we ask your students. So in terms of do we rely on internal data, in here. So there's internal data that based on years of worth of experience, we have figured out this is what things look like at this particular school. That might be because of visits we've done, because of conversations we've had with reps. We are a department that communicates a lot with one another. So when we have a conversation, it's like, hey, listen, you better know about this conversation I had, this morning with this rep, or, I went on this visit, here's what I found out. So there's a lot of communication that happens within our department about conversations that we've had, throughout that year, things that we've learned from the previous school year. We debrief each year about the application process. So, the internal data, I would say, is our experience with what has happened in a previous year with our own applicant pool. And again, based on new information we might find out from a school like the one that I mentioned that said to us, by the way, we're going to be taking a lot less out-of-state applicants. I mean, that really does change the game when you know that now you're looking at the more competitive kids in your own pool of people who's applying to that school, because they're not going to take as many as they took the year before. But there's not necessarily internal data on some sort of a spreadsheet that we're not sharing with other people. It's more based on experience.
Thank you so much for the presentation and so far. And if students interested in international overseas college schools, do they use the same resources here as in Naviance for application?
So in terms of information with GPA and test scores, we do have some data points for international schools. So it will end up depending on the school that you're looking at. In terms of when you're actually applying to those schools, though, they may have a different avenue with which we're sending documents. So I know with some Canadian schools, we'll still send stuff through Naviance, through a system called Parchment that they may utilize. For schools in the UK, they have their own version of Common App that they use, and those schools will need something different in terms of how things are reported or sent to them. So it will end up depending on which country students are applying to schools.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, the question is, how does a student figure out the safety school, the target school, and reach schools? Do they get any help from the counselors, or how do they do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of figuring out how to make a list of target, safety, and reach schools, what we typically do during the junior conference is start talking with your student about, so where are you at in the process at the moment? Have you started to do some research? Have you visited any schools? Do you have some thoughts about what it is that you're looking for in a school? So the reason that we gave this presentation to them as early as November, so they got a very similar presentation, and for example, that screen where it was talking about finding the right fit, and it gave them some factors to start considering. Our hope is that that starts to trigger some thoughts in their mind about okay, maybe what location do I want, and maybe what type of a campus atmosphere am I looking for? Do I think I want a large school or a small school? So all of those types of questions they're hopefully starting to consider. So by the time that we hit March or April, when we're having these junior conferences, we can start talking to them about what are some of those things that you're starting to think about, and have you started to do your own college research? So sometimes that meeting looks a little bit like this. Here's my list, and we start talking to them about okay, do we feel like you've got your strong safety schools? Have you seen those schools? Are they safety schools for a multitude of factors? Are they also affordable? Many years ago, I learned the hard way that it was really important to ask students whether their safety school was not cost prohibitive, because I had a student who got into their safety school, as they should have, and then they couldn't afford their safety school. So it was fast forward now, a decade and a half later, and that's one of the first questions that I say, okay, so just something to consider, how affordable is your safety school? Is this something that is safe for you for a multitude of different reasons? So we will have those types of conversations with your student during the junior conference. It might even be if they haven't really started that, sometimes we sit down with them in that conference and we show them how to use that search engine that we showed you briefly, where they actually select things like, are you looking for four-year schools? Are you looking for a city atmosphere or a town atmosphere? Those are the types of things that we can help them with during that meeting. Sometimes we are still doing that by the time that we hit senior year, because sometimes they start to put together a list, we start to look at the list, and we start to realize, I don't know that you really do have strong safety schools. We really need to start talking about that more. Sometimes it's one of us generating some ideas for them, have you thought about this school or that school? Based on the other places that you're applying, what are some of the other places that we've typically seen students if they've liked those particular schools? If they're applying for a very particular niche major, here are some other places that I'm aware of that have that particular major. Maybe you want to consider those as well. That's another one of the things that we talk about all the time amongst ourselves. All right, so a quiz during lunch. Okay, you have a 3.0 and you have this score. What schools do you tell this kid if they're interested in the following program? So, so we do a lot of that ourselves. And so then when a student does come to us and needs help with formulating a list, we're happy to help them do that. What's difficult is if the student comes to us and says, well, I don't know what size of school I'm looking for, I have no idea about the location. Then you're shooting in the dark, because it's hard to find something for a student who doesn't know what it is that they're looking for. So, I think Ms. Hughes said earlier, we're trying to meet them where they are, right? So there's a lot of conversation about okay, where are you at right now? What have you done thus far? And trying to get them to a point where they're ready to do what it is we need them to do when they hit senior year. And some of them are chomping at the bit right now to be there, and others of them are I'm a junior, what happened? It's just, it just depends on where they're at.
I do want to add to that too, it's a very good question, and the list should be balanced, and I think we've made that clear tonight, but that reach target safety conversation, as Ms. Cahill says, doesn't really truly happen in any real way that matters until senior year, when we're okay, we're up against deadlines, we're applying, what's going on. So just to bring it back to the focus for junior year, I think your goal as parents is just supporting the search right now and not being so heavily focused, well, is this a reach? Is this a target? we wouldn't go into that right now, because it's not important. Right now, you're just getting them to explore and be open, and I have ideas, and figure out what they like and what they don't like. So
That's such a good point. It's actually hard to know whether a school is a target, safety, or reach right now, because most of your students probably don't have standardized testing, and if a school is going to require it, we probably don't really know how they fall.
Yeah, this is explore phase, and try to have a little bit of fun doing it and less stress.
I think that's like a perfect way to conclude our Q&A of the night. I also just want to give a shout out to all of you parents because you guys gave us our best questions yet. Expect the same thing from senior year. So I'll be watching all of you in the fall of senior year. But I want to thank you for attending tonight. Thank you if you submitted questions through email. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we'll follow up with you, or you can reach out to your school counselor. Again, your major takeaway tonight is that this is an exciting process. You have a lot of support here at Ridge High School. Do not hesitate to reach out to us. Encourage your students to come see us if they have any questions. And we do hope that you found this evening helpful. And again, reach out with any questions and enjoy your night.
Thank you.
Take care.
It's like, that's a